So we will begin. Hello everyone, welcome on this webinar on Gender Learning Series in MEAL Integrating Matter. We are so glad with the interest you have shown today. We even had to close registration in the last days because we were overwhelmed with the popularity of our themes. So it really reveals the interest for these issues.
I'm the director of the Spur program. So before we start, I invite you to choose a preferred language for this session. So at the bottom right of your screen, you can pick either French or English. So maybe people, you can switch slides so people will see what I'm referring to. So if it's the first time you're using the interpretation feature on Zoom, so you can pick your language, either French or English. If you have technical issues or if you are unable to pick a language, please use the chat to send a private message to my colleague Nicolas Pena. Donc, avant que nous commencions, je vous invite à choisir votre langue de préférence.
So before we start, I invite you to start your language of preference in French or in English. Thanks to Fanny Poirier, who's our interpreter today. The slideshow will be presented during the session, but they will be in English, but you will be provided with the French version, which we will send in the chat box. So if you wish to follow the presentation in French, that will be available to you. So we will be sending those after this session.
I invite you to choose a preferred language, either French or English, as this session is a bilingual one. OK, donc les membres de l'équipe d'Activer le changement, on se situe à différents endroits à travers le Canada. Donc, on a des personnes dans la ville de Québec.
Spur Change theme is spread out throughout Canada. So we have people in Edmonton and Calgary, in Toronto, etc. And we work closely with the Intercouncil Network. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the territory we stand on today. I am speaking to you from Montreal on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Mi'kmaq Nation. Please state which traditional lands you are stating on in your presentations. For those who do not know about Spur Change program, its goal is to support SMOs in international cooperation through activities of skill sharing, just like the one we will be having today. We organize a lot of learning opportunities and also have a program running for youth implication and social issues matters. Nico, can you please go to the next slide? Donc, voilà.
So this webinar today will be recorded and we will make it available publicly afterward. So we are not going to share the recording of the breakout session publicly, so you can consider this as a safe space to share openly and ask questions to one of the speakers. Please also ensure that you're muted at all time, except if we invite you to unmute to ask questions or comment. You can use the raise hand function if you wish to speak. And you can also use the chat function to share any concerns or questions during the presentation. As I said before, if you have any technical concerns or questions, you can always send a private message to my colleague Nico. So you can find him, Nico Spur Change. Okay, so Nico will send in the chat a contact sheet, sorry. So if you want your contact to be shared with other participants after this call, please add your name and email so we can include it in the follow-up document. And we will also share in the chat a shared resource document. So if we invite participants to add any relevant resources related to the topic of Feminist MEAL in the shared resource document. So we will curate the information from these two documents and send it to you as an outcome document afterward. Okay, Nico, can you switch slides, please? Donc, je suis vraiment heureuse d'initier aujourd'hui cette nouvelle série sur l'intégration du genre et des approches
I am
féministes.
so glad to begin this first series on integration of male practices through a gender and feminist approach into activities. We know these topics are so important in SMO activities. We've been talking about this series for almost a year, but we were waiting for the perfect moment to get it done. So one of the specificities of this series is that we wish to invite leaders and experts in the sector to share their expertise on issues relating to feminism and gender issues in our projects and programs running. So this is the first session planned, but we will have other sessions coming up. You can go on our website to learn about details about the October 14th, sister.
We want these opportunities to be practical and based on the realities of organizations applying these tools and approaches. So the topic of today's session is critical to shift powers toward the community and partners we are working with. We believe that using feminist approach to monitoring and evaluation could increase access to knowledge, and do that, it could be a powerful tool to transform unequal power relations. So we invited 3 speakers from 3 different organizations who are either developing or implementing feminist and gender transformative tools and approach to M&E. So we invited them to share one tool or one approach in order to share their practical experiences using that. So consequently, there will be a presentation portion during the first I think 30 to 40 minutes of this session. It will be followed by a Q&A, and we will then move into breakout group. So we ask you in the registration form to pick one of the 3 topics, and then you will be invited to join a breakout group with the speakers and a facilitator to pursue the conversation on that specific tool. Okay, so without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our 3 speakers. So first, Deborah Simpson, who is a manager of the program Impact at Oxfam Canada. Then we will hear Calais Caswell, who is technical specialist in gender equality and social inclusion at MEDA. And finally, Andres Gouldsborough, who is senior monitoring and evaluation advisor at Plan Canada. So Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andriane. I'll just wait for the slide to come up. To give you a bit of background, Oxfam Canada has been developing a guidance note on Feminist MEAL over the last year or 2, and we just finalized it in June of this year. And rather than being a specific tool, it's more of an approach that includes 7 foundations that we believe are important for development agencies who want to pursue Feminist MEAL. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of background, you may have heard of Oxfam, but just an overview is that Oxfam Canada is one affiliate of the International Oxfam Confederation, which is networked in over 90 countries. Our mission is to build lasting solutions to poverty and justice, and Oxfam Canada specifically focuses on improving the lives and promoting the rights of women and girls. We do that through 4 program areas, one on ending violence against women and girls, one on gender in emergencies, our 3rd is on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and our 4th program area is women's economic empowerment and transformational leadership. And throughout these programs, we're encouraging our partners, our country offices to really adopt feminist approaches to MEAL as a way of building women's rights and gender equality throughout the program implementation and evaluation. So I'm going to start with the first foundation when we get to the slide. Oh, yeah, sorry. To give a bit of a definition first, for Oxfam Canada, we believe that there are 4 key elements to what is Feminist MEAL. The first is that Feminist MEAL is based on an understanding that transformative change in gender and power relations are complex and nonlinear. If we adopt a Feminist MEAL approach, it challenges us to think differently about what is considered evidence. It pushes the boundaries of how evidence is captured, and it questions who gives it meaning and relevance. Feminist MEAL also recognizes the autonomy and independence of partners in the work we do together, and is focused on a relationship of mutual accountability and shared decision-making. And finally, MEAL should support generation of knowledge that is meaningful, accessible, and useful to those who rightly own it. So those we work with and partner organizations. So, as I said, there are 7 foundations. So I'll move to the first foundation. You can go to the next slide, Nico. So the first foundation of Feminist MEAL is that it's an approach or a lens based on feminist research ethics. So what we mean by that is that it surfaces diverse perspectives, women's unique perspective, and gender-based discrimination in order to understand and challenge structural and systemic power relations. And this involves a process that includes contextualization, learning, collaboration, participation, inclusivity, and responsiveness. And overall, it should promote transformative social change. So Feminist MEAL is part of the process by which social change occurs. And it includes investigating how race, class, caste, ethnicity, and religion influences the way women experience inequality and discrimination. So our second foundation is that, as I said, monitoring and evaluation, feminist monitoring and evaluation is an integral part of social transformation. So it gives participants agency, and it recognizes that the personal experience and perspectives of those involved can be transformative. So participating in Feminist MEAL can actually transform relationships. So it positions monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning as an integral part of social transformation rather than a process that occurs at the end of a program. Our third foundation is that Feminist MEAL shifts power to participants. So the ownership of the Feminist MEAL process should be with partners and participants, and partners co-design and co-own the overall process. So this requires that we think about how we share and manage risk and accountability. It can include capacity development for partners so that they are empowered to lead and co-own the overall process, and also to ensure that risks aren't disproportionately distributed to partner organizations and those we work with. So our fourth foundation is that the role of the evaluator shifts from expert to being a facilitator and technical support provider. So that allows partners to take the lead in how to do Project MEAL. And obviously this requires a MEAL officer or evaluator that is able to practice reflexivity. So a reflexive approach moves beyond understanding women, men, or gender diverse groups as participants or beneficiaries and recognizes the power imbalances in the relationship between participant and evaluator. This approach attempts to rebalance the power dynamics and recognize that people in all their diversity are agents of their own lives and actors in their community and society, and that they hold knowledge. It also means recognizing our own positioning as an international development organization and what knowledge we have access to and can feed into. So our fifth foundation is around valuing collective knowledge generation that is context-driven. So it promotes the generation of collective knowledge rather than sort of individual expert knowledge. It acknowledges that there are many ways of knowing, and importantly, that some are more privileged than others. It focuses on collecting context-driven knowledge, and Feminist MEAL must be rooted in intersectionality. So the multiple aspects of identity that play out in people's lives and experience, including gender, class, age, race, or ethnicity. So Feminist MEAL gathers and analyzes data through an intersectional lens, recognizing the heterogeneity of communities and groups. So our sixth foundation is that there's a learning orientation to evaluative exercises. It promotes evidence-based decision-making, and it prioritizes strategic program learning that strengthens collective ownership of the program. And finally, our seventh foundation is that Feminist MEAL must be rooted in safe programming guided by do no harm. So it's essential that we implement ethical and safety standards when working with our partners, and equally important that our partners ensure that the people we work with, or often referred to as beneficiaries, have informed consent so they know what they are taking part in and where, when, how, and why the data or content will be used. So these are the 7 foundations that we believe are important for Feminist MEAL. And as I'll discuss in the breakout room, it's not necessary that an organization include all 7 elements. There might be certain elements that are more important for a particular project or as a starting place. And I'm going to give an example of a feminist baseline for a project in Dhaka, Bangladesh, that draws on some of these foundations in the breakout room. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Deborah. So the guidance note on Feminist MEAL that Deborah mentioned and that was developed by Oxfam Canada will be sent to participants afterward. The note, I think, is available in French, English, and Spanish, right?
That's right.
Exactly. So we will send it to you in the outcome document. And as Deborah said, she will talk a little bit more about how do you implement this by using a case study in the breakout room. Okay, so now let's turn to Calais. So Calais is going to talk about the Gender Action Learning System, the GALS. So Calais, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Great. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Great to see so many people and faces on the call today. So as was mentioned at the beginning, my name is Calais Caswell. I'm a technical specialist on gender equality and social inclusion at MEDA. And so MEDA is a nonprofit that's based out of Waterloo, and we focus on improving GESI, or gender equality and social inclusion, within market systems. So as mentioned, today I'll be speaking about the use of the Gender Action Learning System, specifically in one of our projects in Nigeria, and how this methodology enables men, women, and their families to discuss, address, and strategize around gender-related issues at the household and community level. Next slide, please. So the guiding theory of change for our gender-related work at MEDA is our GESI framework. So projects are designed to advance gender equality and social inclusion in a project to promote more inclusive market systems by focusing on the core domains of change within the inner rings of the diagram. So improving agency and rights, access and use, and fostering a gender just and equitable enabling environment. So the design of gender responsive or feminist MEAL tools and gender transformative interventions like GALS are intended to measure GESI related behavior change and system change against the domains of the framework. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So the Nigeria Way, or Women in Youth project, is an example of a gender-targeted project for MEDA, as it specifically focuses on the challenges, needs, and opportunities experienced by systemically marginalized groups, women and youth, in northeastern Nigeria. So the image on the left there, there's a lot of tiny text, but hopefully you can see the either now or afterward when the presentation's shared. The image on the left really nicely encapsulates what the project is all about. So WAY stands for Women and Youth, as I mentioned. It's a 5-year project primarily in Bauchi State in northeastern Nigeria. We're currently in year 4 of the project. So the project supports women and youth entrepreneurs in 3 value chains: rice, groundnut, and soya. The project also addresses broader societal issues, including early and forced girl-child marriage. So a little bit about the gender norms context where the project is operating. There's a strong traditional and conservative influence on gender and social norms, including female seclusion, or PERDA, with impacts on women's mobility and access to market information and resources. There's a high prevalence of poverty and early and forced girl-child marriage, as I mentioned. Women are involved in economic activities, but often more informal and smaller scale, yet they play a very important role in familial sustenance. Men and religious and traditional authorities are key influencers in gender norms, as are grandmothers in their communities. The image in the center demonstrates some of the primary community and gender-based issues that were identified by project stakeholders that have helped to kind of guide the project's community partners' work on gender equality in the project. And the image on the right demonstrates the change process model that the project utilizes to engage community members in dialogue to promote women and girls' empowerment and foster gender equality. Next slide, please. So what is the Gender Action Learning System? GALS is originated from the Participatory Action Learning System, or PALS, which introduced pictorial empowerment tools for life visioning, planning, analysis, and networking to primarily members of savings and credit groups. So GALS was piloted with an increased focus on gender issues through Oxfam initially, and later by HEVOS in value chain development programming in East Africa. So GALS is a participatory empowerment methodology that provides rural and illiterate men and women with tools to enable them to identify key issues and undertake goal setting in their lives to develop a vision for change. The GALS training is often done with spouses from the same household and includes tools for analyzing intra-household relationships to bring awareness to gender issues and promote positive change in gender relations. GALS tools and participatory processes can be adapted for gender mainstreaming and participatory strategy development on many issues, including economic empowerment, livelihoods improvement programming, value chain development, environmental management, health, etc. Next slide, please. So GALS can be considered a feminist meal approach in 2 ways because of what it measures. So GALS seeks to make visible and to challenge gender inequalities and cultural norms that have existed for generations, as well as inequitable power dynamics within households, communities, and market systems. So to Deborah's point from her earlier slide, GALS can both shift gender relations and challenge inequitable power dynamics as an activity, but it also serves as a meal tool, so it can accomplish both functions. In market systems programming, it enables participants to identify and dismantle obstacles in their environment, including challenging service providers and private sector actors to strengthen their negotiating power. And the second way in which it could be considered a feminist meal tool is because of its measurement approach. So as a community-driven empowerment methodology, GALS prioritizes the inclusion and active participation of more systemically marginalized individuals to identify needs and concerns from their own perspectives. In this way, it positions women and men as drivers of their own personal and economic development rather than as passive recipients of aid. As mentioned, it leverages visual diagrams and learning tools, as well as participatory monitoring and planning processes known as the Community Action Learning System. So we'll talk a little bit about that. to define and track change outcomes, rather than more rigid donor and implementer-driven measurement tools like indicators and different frameworks. It's also highly localized. So local partners are initially, or participants, sorry, are initially trained as peer GALS trainers or GALS community champions by expert facilitators, ideally. And then these trainees are expected to cascade learnings to other men and women in their communities. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see examples of, on the left-hand side, one of the GALS tools with different components, various components outlined within that tool. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the phases that are used when implementing the GALS approach. So some of the core tools that are used are road journeys. So these are primarily visual tools. So the drawing of road journeys, which is the image there on the left, which is an example of what's called a multi-lane highway framework. Also challenge trees, circle maps, and diamonds. In terms of the phases that are used to implement the tool, under phase 1, this is called the catalyst phase. So activities revolve around the training of trainers and cascading of trainings to the community from peer trainers. Phase 2 is when the community action learning sessions are begun, and these reinforce the learnings from phase 1. So this process is implemented at 3 levels: individual, group, and organizational. And then in phase 3, there's a participatory gender review and anchoring process to track progress at the individual and group levels of trainees that have been trained thus far. And the aggregation of information on change that can then be reported against by an implementing partner such as MEDA, for example. Next slide, please. So here you can see a sample monitoring tool that's used by the GALS approach. So community champions come together during review workshops to monitor commitments and progress to achieve the visions and goals that were identified by participants through their visual tools. There's also a quantitative monitoring template that comes with this process that can be used by local partners to help track progress by the community champions if you're using a local partner-driven model. Next slide, please. So a little bit about how we've piloted the GALS approach in the Nigeria Way project. We had in December 2019 our initial training of trainers session, so the kickoff to phase 1. And something regarding the Nigeria project that makes it really interesting is that fundamental to the sustainability of our gender work is strategic partnerships with local partners and building their capacity on gender equality mainstreaming. So we actually have a few indicators that are linked to strengthening capacity of these local partners. These partners include the Federation of Muslim Women's Associations in Nigeria, or FOMWAN, Fahimta Women and Youth Development Initiative, and the Child is Gold Foundation. Another aspect of our sustainability strategy for gender equality programming is the project's Gender and Youth Advisory Committee, where members are trained as gender resource persons. So both partners and these resource persons were trained on the GALS approach. So the project was able to leverage savings and loan group networks that were both established and or strengthened by the project to be able to select these community champions, these peer trainers. We just finished phase 2 this summer, where the same consultants who work to support phase 1 were able to check back in with community champions to see how they've been implementing GALS themselves and their progress thus far in socializing the approach to others in the community as per their commitments that were outlined. Some of the key issue areas that GALS in the Nigeria Way looks at are improving women's access to and control over productive resources, improving decision-making in the household, promoting the equitable participation and benefits arising from project activities between men and women, encouraging more equitable workloads between family members, and influencing gender and social norms around women's economic empowerment and issues around early marriage. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go, thanks. So just a little bit on the progress, this is my last slide. So on the screen here, you can see a couple of our participants that were involved in both phases 1 and 2. So Alti here, the woman on the right, she shared the Happy Family Tree tool with her husband after the initial GALS training she received, and he developed an interest. And since then, she's reported that they have now more increased consultation on joint decision-making practices, including investment and expense decision-making within the household. And they hope to be able to role model this behavior to others who will participate in the GALS process. The Happy Family Tree exercise was also used to address stereotypes within the community around men's allyship, including a stereotype that is called the woman rapper stereotype, so that men can be more supportive of women and won't be chastised for doing so. We've also, through GALS, been able to engage religious leaders. During one local training, one of the religious leaders who's been involved spoke openly about how religion is not a barrier to equality, and his wife was also present and was able to speak openly and confidently. And when she hugged her husband, everybody was cheering and was really excited to see that unity in that messaging. Men participants have commented that their eyes are now open to how much domestic burden women have to shoulder, and that change needs to happen in that regard. Children have been able to, within the households where parents have been trained on GALS, are now adapting the methodology to use for their own vision mapping, particularly daughters, which is really interesting. And recently, a delegation from IFAD's Climate Change Adaptation Program in Nigeria visited with 10 of our community champions. And the delegation found it quite shocking, apparently, that husbands were proudly talking in public about helping their wives with household chores, and that families were sitting together, as this wasn't a cultural norm. So for the next coming months here, the project team is currently following up on planning follow-up activities to carry on from phase 2, and also to take a more critical eye to look at how the GALS monitoring and data that's being collected will feed more efficiently into our project donor reporting to Global Affairs Canada. And next slide, and that's it for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Calais. Calais will also share, she also already shared with us a few resources that will be included in the outcome document. So as we transition to the third presentation, I invite you to write down your questions for Deborah and Calais, as we will have a brief Q&A before moving to the breakout group. So our third and last panelist is Andres Gouldsborough. So he is a Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor at Plan Canada, and he will be presenting the Women and Girls Empowerment Index.
Perfect. Thank you, Adrian. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to for me to share the Women's and Girls Empowerment Index with you. Let me start by saying that, you've already figured out by the previous presentations that there's kind of two big buckets in terms of Feminist MEAL. One is how we do MEAL, right? In terms of a process that engages and empowers, women and participants, right? Where they own the data and so on. We've got plenty examples of those at Plan Canada as well, in terms of participatory action research with adolescents, women's organizations actually carrying out the whole monitoring of the process. But there is another bucket that it's important to mention as well, that is what we measure, right? And that is critical in terms of, considering your processes, feminist, using a feminist approach in terms of what we measure. So I want to focus on that second piece. Hence, I'm going to introduce to you guys the Women and Girls Empowerment Index. Next slide, Nico. But before I go there, I have, and the next one as well. And next, there you go. So before I go there, I do have to explain what is gender transformative programming. That's essential. So Plan Canada has been moving towards, having all of our projects being gender transformative. What does that mean? It's extremely simple. Is we have to design projects that really address the root causes of inequality, right? So this wording around not so much working around changing the condition of women and girls, but changing that position. And that's a very, very important distinction, right? So changing the condition could be like look, you can give bursaries and grants to adolescent girls so that they now go to school. They were not going to school, they're now going to school. That changes their condition. But changing the position is different, is actually empowering, creating a sense of agency so that they go to school because of that agency. That distinction is very important. So that's our gender transformative programming. What does it mean? Next slide, Nico. If you're really addressing the root cause, and I think you can click there 5 times so that we get the 5 boxes, perfect. So what does this mean, right? Addressing the root causes of inequality. In our theory of change, we say, like, if we're gonna do this right, you have to address 5 main pillars, right? Roles and responsibilities, access and control over resources, participation and decision-making, gender norms, and duty bearers, so responsiveness of government and so on. So we, like, if we're going to do it right, we have to work across these 5 domains. Keep that in mind when I'm talking about the index. Okay. Next slide. How does this translate into a project? Next one. Sorry. There you go. So that's kind of like now we kind of have like this standard theory of change. Think of it like an LM, right? So this is how it looks like more or less. And I want you to focus on that first pillar. So right now, as a rights-based organization, our ultimate outcome always revolves around increased realization of rights. Whatever, sexual reproductive health, economic empowerment, you name it, education, that's kind of like our ultimate goal. And we have different streams, right? But the one I want to focus is that first intermediate outcome. For those that are familiar or not familiar with the LM, that's kind of like one of the big pillars within a project. And always, we speak about improved agency of women and girls to exercise decisions, et cetera, regarding their health, whatever. So here's the pickle. This is what happened. So we're moving towards gender transformative programming, right? We know it's complex and multifaceted. And now we have this stream that's always around agency, which is a big word. Right? So we were like, okay, how do we measure this, right? That was the genesis of the Women's and Girls Empowerment Index. Next slide, please. So that's it. It was like a recognition that gender transformative programming is multifaceted and integrated. All these 5 components are interrelated. Again, that, you know, it's about addressing the root causes of gender inequality. And, you know, when you delve into it, like, these are very difficult to capture, right? And you know, there was this recognition that we had to move beyond proxy indicators or indicators of approximation, right? You know, the classic example is like, well, I'm going to measure empowerment through, you know, income of women. Well, no, that's so 1980s, right? So we know that income is not necessarily a measure of empowerment. So moving beyond that, and we also wanted to create something that was standardized, right? That we could apply in all of our projects. So we put a team together and came up, Nico, next slide, sorry, with the Women's and Girls Empowerment Index. Before I go into the details, 2 things that you really need to understand. So this index serves like 2 purposes. I mean, number 1, of course, it's an index, right? And it's an index that measures these 5 domains that I mentioned: duty bearers, norms and attitudes, participation, and so on. But the way it's organized, and you'll see it in a sec, it's like, you know, it's the index at the top. Think of it like any index that you know, right? Human Development Index, and so on. That's how it works, right? You have all these different variables, and through a scoring and weighting mechanism, right, you aggregate them into one single score, right? So at the end of the day, you have like, okay, this is the situation in terms of empowerment of girls and women in this particular region, right? So that's one, and we can demonstrate results through that index. And I'll show it in a second. But it also serves as a framework, right? Because it's constructed as an index with domains and subdomains and variables to measure. And each of these subdomains, you'll see it in a sec, and domains have associated indicators, not only that index at the top. You can actually, when you're constructing your PMF, you can actually pick and choose different indicators and plug them in your PMF. So it serves also as a menu, and I'll show you an example in a second. What the biggest challenge when developing this, because we want it to be like standardized, is creating something that was generic enough that it would fit in every single type of project. Economic empowerment, health, whatever it was, it would be able to fit, and that was challenging. But I think we nailed it, hopefully. Okay, so let's go to it. Nico, next slide, please. Okay, so this is it. I know you can't read the bottom, but we will get to that in a sec. So here's the index. You see at the bottom, you'll find like the different domains, subdomains, and variables that feed into the calculation of this index. At the end of the day, what do we want? We want one single score. Again, think of Human Development Index, whatever, it's one score, usually in a scale from 0 to 100, right? So we measure all these domains, and then we kind of trickle that up through a scoring and weighting mechanism to kind of develop a score, usually standardized from 0 to 100, right? So usually what we plug in our PMFs, what we put in our PMFs is that first indicator. It's the average score of the Women and Girls Empowerment Index. At baseline, it was 55. At end line, when we measure when the project is done, it went up to 70, or it went down to 40. It happens sometimes. Let's hope not, but that's the reality. So that's kind of the main indicator, and we usually put it at the ultimate outcome indicator, and we measure it. Now, of course, you wanna understand a little bit the details. Let's go through them. Next slide, Nico. So here are the variables, and this is how it works. So one of the domains that we measure, so that's the one that you'll see at the top, it's the domain. One that we measure is gender roles and responsibilities, right? Again, it has like if you want like a sub indicator that you can use in your PMS. So percentage of women or girls experiencing equitable assignment and distribution of roles and responsibilities, right? You will ask me, I get this question all the time, yes, Andres, but what does equitable mean? Of course, there is a system to bring all these together into, again, scoring and weighting and thresholds to determine what is equitable or not. So under that domain, we measure time poverty and burden of work. Again, it has an associated indicator there. You see average time women and girls spend in unpaid work. That's our standard indicator. And it has these different variables that we measure, right? Then another subdomain, if you wish, is attitudes and perceptions regarding gender roles and responsibilities. More attitudinal, but again, with an associated indicator and all these variables that we measure. If you notice, it's so generic that you could actually apply to any project. Of course, when we translate this into a tool, we tweak a little bit, right? The questions and the phrases to adapt it to the tool. Next slide. I'm not going to go through the details of every single one, but just so that you get a sense of what we capture. Nico, next one. Thank you. So the other domain is access and control. Again, associated indicator, and then two subdomains, right? Now, the beauty of having these subdomains and domains and so on is that you can report, there's so much richness in terms of what you can report. So for example, you can report on the full index, like 70, that's it. But you can also disaggregate by domains and subdomains and kind of get a feeling of how the project is evolving by these different areas. So look, guys, roles and responsibilities, there's been a huge shift, but access and control, not so much. What are we going to do, right? That's kind of like the logic. Next, Nico, third domain would be, I think it's participation. Yes, participation and decision making. That's the other domain. And then we kind of measure it at both levels, household level and then public community level, with all these variables. The next one, in the interest of time, would be social norms. So degree, extent to which women and girls are perceived as equal to men or boys. Again, this is constructed, and very likely when we get to a discussion in the breakout groups, we can talk about like how difficult it is to measure social norms. The framework is awesome, right? But when the rubber hits the road is when you're constructing the tool and the questions and so on. That's kind of like the challenge. So social norms is our fourth one, I think. And the fifth one would be duty bearers. Yeah, so it's basically measuring like the level of gender responsiveness of primary duty bearers. So depending on the project, it would be like how responsive is the municipal government, or how responsive is the Ministry of Health, or etc. But then we measure that either through measuring them directly, like the institution, or through the perceptions of the women and the adolescents themselves. So that's the framework. How do we use it? Next one. Oh no, sorry. Before I talk, how do we use? I just want to give you. No, go ahead, Nico. Sorry. This is an example. So I explained how it works as an index very briefly, but I want you to see how it works as a framework. So this is a PMF for what is this? Ethiopia. Okay, yeah. So for our Ethiopia project, and as you can see, what's highlighted there in whatever that color is, and are the indicators that we bring from the framework. So of course the index up there, and let me just take a second to explain this because it's very important. So of course we have sectoral indicators at that ultimate outcome level. So of course the project is about CFM, like early forced marriage, and SRHR, right? So of course our two main indicators are around teenage pregnancy and CFM, right? Those are our sectoral. But because we're saying that we're doing gender transformative programming, to ensure that we're changing the position and not only the condition, right? We include that women's empowerment index, right? Saying that, look, it's through empowerment that we are achieving these sectoral outcomes, if you wish. But then at the lower levels, you will see that there are examples of other indicators that we bring from the framework, and we also measure. And lastly, I think, because I don't think I have time for challenges and so on, like, of course, how do we use it, right? So as I explained, we have, this, overall results, or, domain results, and we use it to demonstrate change, baseline, midline, endline, right? So that score increasing or not. It's a relatively easy way to demonstrate change in something that is very, very complex, right? Now more and more, we are trying to demonstrate impact by adding a counterfactual, right? So more and more what we're doing is not only measuring with the intervention groups, but with a comparison group, both at baseline and endline, so we can talk about like a difference in differences, right? For plan, we're not there yet, I have to accept this, but for plan, what we wanted to do with a standardized tool is be able to present the bigger picture, right? To aggregate our results across projects, not only talk about Ethiopia or Peru, but in general, this is what's going on. So a standardized approach allows you to aggregate. And lastly, this is an interesting one. We're not there yet, but this is the plan, is to understand causality. Right, so I have a problem with that word. Causal relationships between the different domains, right? So you can run with this richness of data, you can run inferential statistics and kind of understand like which of these domains and subdomains are the determinants of success. Which are moving the health indicators, which are moving the empowerment index themselves, so that in the future we can make better decisions in terms of what how we program. I have one last slide on challenges, but I think that I'm going to leave it for the breakout groups. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci Andres, merci à tous les trois.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you to all of you. Our presentators and facilitators have been so respectful of our timeline today. So we have a good 10 minutes to have our Q&A. Please keep in mind that we will be able to have a more in-depth conversation in our breakout rooms. In our discussion groups, you will be able to go a bit more deeply in the conversation, where you will be able to share your own resources and the questions you may have. But we can still have a moment together to have some questions together. There's two ways you can ask a question. You can write it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and just directly ask your question to the room. So while we wait for you to write up your questions, I have one. I imagine a lot of you are wondering whether how these tools and these approaches may adapt themselves to the realities of a SMO, because Oxfam, Plan Canada, and SEDA are large organizations. So how can we adapt these tools to our own framework? And specifically, Calais and Andres, I was wondering about the capacity of the resources that you need internally to implement these tools. So how many people, for example, have to work on the implementation of these tools so the whole team can use them? So maybe Calais, you could answer first.
Sorry, Andriana, I don't think my interpretation is working.
Okay, I can translate. I can
Thank
translate
you,
in English.
sorry.
Yes, no worry. So I was saying that one question that a participant might be wondering is, how does this approach or tool adapt to my reality as a small and medium organization? So the questions for you is, what are the resources needed internally for MEDA to be able to apply this tool?
Mm-hmm. So, and we can definitely go into greater detail in the breakout room on this. I think that gals, depending on the size of your organization, the reason why I think it would fit well with a smaller organization is because, as I mentioned, it's community driven, and it's really driven by this self-catalyzing approach where trainees train others and it cascades from there. So the way in which I suppose the dedication of resources from MEDA, we're having an expert facilitator at both phase 1 and phase 2, just to be able to kick off the process. So if you have the resources available to be able to have somebody to lead that process on the ground, that's definitely probably the best way to go. However, the tool itself, which, as Andriane mentioned, I believe I've shared, there's a really comprehensive manual from Oxfam, is very intuitive. So it's something where if you had a local programming staff or even someone at headquarters who could self-specialize in the use of the tool, you could really easily kick off the pilot that way. We also kind of doubled down on our resourcing in the sense that we were able to leverage the fact that we had local partners to be able to not only become trained in the tool, but also to help in monitoring the progress. So the communities, as I mentioned, monitor their own progress, which is another kind of added benefit that takes away you having to invest additional resources. However, having local partners that can kind of keep an eye on the change process that's happening is really useful to be able to feed that information back to you as an organization. So depends on the level of resourcing you have available, but it's flexible.
Thank you, Calais. I don't know, Andres and Deborah, if you would like to respond to that question before I move to the next one in the chat.
So super quickly, like, I'm not going to lie to you, like, you've seen the framework. It's, you can get a sense that it's very resource intensive in terms of, budget for baselines and, the time and resources to analyze it and so on. But I think that the important point here is that if you look at it as a framework, right? And if you look at it as, kind of like the message here is, if you have a smaller organization, but kind of think of a framework within your size, within what you're doing, right? Think about different areas and domains, and and also think of it as a menu. Pick and choose, and you can have small, more controllable tools under social norms, for example. But make it robust. Think about the tool. Think about the variables, and you can do it with not so many resources. So it's transferable in that way.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add that, for our purposes, we see these as principles that are, key elements to doing Feminist MEAL, but it's not a tool itself. And we would adopt particular kinds of tools that build on these approaches or these foundations.
Mm-hmm.
But Adriana, if I may, 1 second,
Yeah.
sorry. And again, thinking about these two buckets, forget about my tool for a second, but think about Feminist MEAL as a process that empowers, women, that empowers, they have ownership of the data. That one, in terms of resources, you also have to think very critically, right? We get pushed from donors, interest, Feminist MEAL, do it participatory, involved, and so on, without the recognition that you have to put many things in place, right? To do this participatory with women empowerment, it takes a long time. You have to have all these consultations, not even consultations, work with them to develop. And also in many cases, the precondition is capacity development, right? For example, you can't do participatory action research with adolescents in Peru. This is one of our projects, without 7 months of training on, methods, research, recollection, and so on. So there is a heavy investment to make this happen, right? If you want to do it right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andres. So we have a few questions here. So one question from Shazad. So thanks for a nice presentation. How practical these approaches are applicable in humanitarian context? The main examples shared are more development programming. So who would like to respond?
I can respond. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andres. Okay. I think the principles that are part of our guidance note on Feminist MEAL can be adapted to the humanitarian context as well. Because it's really thinking through the key questions. What is the role of the evaluator? How do participants and partner organizations take part in monitoring and evaluation and take ownership of that monitoring and evaluation? So I do think it's possible to take Feminist MEAL approaches in humanitarian contexts.
Yeah, and I can chime in briefly as well. I mean, I think it depends on the humanitarian context for sure. I think though, because GALS is, as I mentioned, it's a monitoring tool, but it's also primarily a dialogue tool. So depending on the extent to which your organization is engaging in promoting community dialogues on various issues regarding the impacts of a conflict, healing from conflict, peace building, any of those sorts of things, there's definitely a window to be able to consider integrating more gender transformative activities like GALS that simply use, more participatory development planning tools into those dialogues that can help to analyze these kind of gender related issues. So I think it's flexible enough that you could use the approach itself and kind of fit it to meet your needs in that context.
No, go ahead. So we have time for another question. No, it's fine.
Yes, okay, so a question from Fortunata. How do you measure perception attitude in the Women and Girls Empowerment Index? Do you give number?
I love that question because that is so difficult. So if you ask me in terms of like the mechanics, it's usually a set of phrases where they would have like a Likert scale where they would say from strongly agree or disagree, right? That's easy. The challenge is, what are these statements, right? So that's what we've been evolving, because look, like there's a lot of politically correctness in answers. People know what they need to answer, and so look, if you go to a household and ask them like who makes decisions, your wife, husband, or jointly, everybody says jointly. They know what to say, right? So it's a little bit about like the particular questions, and what we've learning, like we have a list of rock star questions or statements that we know that they work consistently. So in a nutshell, yes, it's through that scale, but it's having very, very smart statements that actually uncover the real perceptions and attitudes, right? I'll give you a quick example. One rock star question that we have, or statement, it revolves around, look, if a girl is dressed inappropriately, it's kind of her fault if she gets like assaulted. That, I strongly agree, disagree, And that one really, we've seen it really uncovers like what the inner beliefs or perceptions of participants, while there are others that don't. If you ask them, like, if you know, should a girl deserve education as a boy, for example, that's a bad question, because they will always say yes, of course, right? So it's about the question and how smart you are in terms of drafting.
Merci. Andres, does your interpretation feature work when I speak French? Because I want to ask the next question in French, and this is for you.
Try it.
Okay. Donc, Caroline Leblanc nous dit...
Carole Leblanc is asking, we also have an index analyzing the women's power. It's a pretty solid index that is very demanding in resource and research-wise, but it's very complete and pertinent. So I'm wondering, what is the actual work that goes into the analysis of these factors when you are done with the study?
Did you get that?
Yes, kind of. The last little part, what is the...
So
I got everything except the question.
Yeah, the question is how much time and resources are necessary to collect and analyze the data,
yes,
especially at the baseline.
Yes, this is one of the challenges that we can speak at length. It takes a long time, and like in theory, that's fine. There's a couple of challenges here. One is the length of the questionnaire. We can talk about that later. But in terms of the timing, it does take a lot of time, you know, in terms of data collection, training enumerators, but also the analyzing of the data. So that is a big, you know, because these are composites and you have to run a lot of calculations. Now, the challenge here is that we get pressure from the donors. I'm sure many of you guys do, in terms of, guys, you have to give me a baseline in 3 months, right? So that timing doesn't always work for us. So yes, it is for sure a challenge.
Okay, merci Andres. Donc, je vais prendre une dernière question.
Thank you, Andres. I'm going to take one last question before we go to the discussion groups. Marie-Lou Villeneuve is asking, if I'm understanding right, in the Oxfam case, it's also about evaluating so that we can evaluate the feminist approach in each step of the process, either local or locally. But I think MEDA is different because it has a specific tool to try to help women and girls gain more autonomy and power in their familial context.
So who would like to respond or react? So she's asking clarification around the Oxfam tool, if it's a guide to ensure that that you are using a feminist approach at each step of your project. Deborah, would you like to clarify?
Yeah, it's specifically for monitoring and evaluation rather than project planning and implementation, although obviously building a monitoring and evaluation plan into a project needs to happen from the outset. So I don't know if that addresses the question.
Okay, she said yes, thanks.
You're
okay,
welcome.
So I now invite you to the next portion of this webinar, which is going to be the more participatory portion of the webinar. So we invited you in the registration form to identify which tool or approach you would like to learn more about. So based on your responses, we've created breakout rooms. So in each room, there will be one speaker and one facilitator from the Spur Change team. And there will be a facilitated conversation where you will be invited to share additional questions or your experience using different tools. So I should also mention that there will be one room with the interpretation feature. So for those who would like to attend in French, you will need to stay in the main room with Calais and the gals tool. Otherwise, the 2 other rooms will be in English. So to decide which room will have interpretation, we identify where most of the francophones wanted to be, and we've decided to turn this room with the interpretation. Donc, la pièce principale, celle où sera Calais, sera...
So the main room will be with Calais and will be featuring interpretation service. So for the French-speaking people who would like to access the conversation with the interpretation service, please ensure that you make sure that the... Oh yeah, we'll also make sure that Calais can hear the interpretation service. So if you need interpretation towards French, please stay in the main room, as the other conversation groups will be in English solely. So Nico? Are you ready to launch the invitations for the conversation groups?
All right, welcome everybody. I think we're having just still folks sort of joining in right now. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes or two. Okay. All right. So Andres, I just want to confirm, are you here? Can you hear me?
I am, yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Great. Well, welcome to the breakout room, everybody. As you may know, I'm Nico. I'm part of the Spur Change team. I'm just going to take a minute or so just to do a little bit of facilitation in sort of grounding of this breakout. So this in itself, it's more of an in-depth sort of conversation around the tool that Andres has just shared with you, but also is to determine as a group who would like to be the rapporteur back to the main room. So I would welcome you to, even if you have your camera on, to do a show of hands if you want to volunteer to take notes and be the rapporteur from the discussion. So would anybody like to do the volunteering? Maybe raise your hand if I see some folks. If not, you can put it in the chat. No adventures to take some notes and give some thoughts about it. All right, Heather, thank you. Great. So as part of this discussion, there's a lot of questions that have already been developed. If you have some burning questions, please do so. But Andres, I will just give you the floor.
Perfect. Let me put my video on. Let me get organized. Okay, so I had this whole, I can share my screen, right, Nico?
Yeah, you can share your screen, yeah.
Okay, we'll figure that one out later. Okay, so welcome everybody. I have this whole sequence to guide this breakout group, but in my tradition, I'm gonna break it a little bit. And I'm going to maybe start with, are there any, questions that you have regarding, my presentation or the index? And maybe we can start with questions and then kind of like focus this discussion towards the implementations towards medium and small organizations. If you have, just, unmute and ask your question if you have any.
Yeah, I have a question.
Perfect.
When I was listening to you, pardon?
Yeah, no, perfect.
I was listening and I thought it was very quantitative. It's all about trying to get numbers and even using caps and putting, even in self-description, do I feel empowered? And then you would quantify everything. And I was just wondering where you allow the equality and the transformation, like how do you capture it, like the qualitative aspect, because you put the qualitative, you put the you may use the qualitative, but it's all the quantitative, it becomes quantities. Do you understand?
Yes,
Or does it make sense?
yes.
Okay.
I get your question 100%. And I have this bad reputation in plan because of my quantitative focus. But let me be clear. Like this, this is used kind of like to be able to measure in a way. It's imperfect like every index, but to measure in a way all these dimensions and be able to put them together, right, into like a score. One is to get like a global picture, but also in terms of our reporting, right? We, if you look at our PMFs, at least for Global Affairs Canada and many other donors, they are expecting numbers, not like a narrative in when we report. Now, having said that, we are working towards a mechanism, like all these tools. Every time we do a baseline or endline or whatever, it's always mixed methods, right? So it is the survey, but it also has the qualitative component. In the old days, not in the old days, but recently, we would do them at the same time. Right, so the consultant or ourselves would go and administer the surveys, and at the same time have key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and so on, to bring that richness to that data, a face, right? Usually the qualitative is like the why, but why, and so on. But this is an important point. We're moving towards a two-stage approach, which I like. People might say no, but and this two-stage approach is. So we have like our regular baseline, to give you an example, data collection, bit more quantitative in its nature. And then the second stage is our gender assessments, right? We always have to do gender assessments in our project, which is qualitative in nature. So what we want to do is kind of run the quantitative piece first, run the analysis, have an analysis and interpretation workshops with our field counterparts. What is this? Why is it high? Why is it low? This makes no sense. Why? And then we develop the qualitative tool based on the findings here. And then we explore all those whys. Can we always afford it? No, because sometimes we have pressures from donors and so on, but we try as much as possible to combine both. Any other question, guys?
Hi, it's Kerry Brinker from College of the Rockies in Cranbrook, BC. I was quite fascinated by the tool. I like a good quantitative tool like that. I'm curious though, because of from the training many of us have now received, we've seen the importance of involving beneficiaries in data collection, as well as, I would imagine, in the processes related to data collection. So I guess my question, Andreas, is to what extent were, say beneficiaries, say girls and women, involved in the creation of the index? And to what degree maybe have you observed that simply the idea of an index is a real Western-based notion that may not be consistent with, say, the culture of the countries in which you and others are working in? Thank you.
Agree 100%. And there's this other notion to complement what you're saying, Kerry, in terms of which we can discuss at large around quantitative not being feminist, right, and qualitative being feminist. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but anyway, yes, I agree. The Western part of it being an index and so on, and relatively imposed. Look, I'm going to be very candid with you guys. This is a process and it's evolving, right? Like Deborah said from Oxfam, like those principles that they set there, it's where we want to go, but it is a continuum and it takes a long time. So, the latest versions, the older versions of when we apply the WGET, very top down. Very, but guys, it's all, GAC tells me I have to submit a baseline in 3 months. I can't do a participatory process. I just can't afford it. But we're pushing back, right? We're pushing back. And so, for example, I know right now that we have a project starting up in Ghana and one in Egypt, and both of them will have the WGET, but consultations are, with women prior so that they define their domains. What does access and control mean for a woman in Egypt in the value chain sector, right? In the carpet sector. So these consultations will take place in order for them, to develop like their domains and their questions and so on. We have a project in Ethiopia and Ghana, Women's Voice and Leadership, that works with women's organizations. And that was, again, we're working with them to kind of define what does this, we were like, how do you want to measure this, right? And there's some interesting aspects to it, because they, the women's organizations in their brilliancy said, look, at the end of the day, what I want to measure is the vibrancy of the movement. Great. Now, how do you do that? Then we have to deconstruct all these things with them. So we're moving slowly towards that, right? And even what I've just explained is consultation. You know what I mean? I can consult women's and kind of create a tool based on what they tell me. But is it extractive, or am I empowering them through that process? That's a completely different angle, right? Which takes a lot of time. As I mentioned, besides the index, we have this group in Peru of adolescents that are doing participatory action research. But we have to invest 7 months before to bring them to a point where the process, they can take ownership of the process and that it's empowering. I take your point, Carrie. Yes, we're moving towards that there, but it will take time. And hopefully what I want to see is that maybe the index is debunked, right? Maybe it's like, that's not what we need. This is not what we want to do, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. I appreciate that.
Hi, Andres.
Hi.
From FIT at MCC, and based on what I heard, is very difficult to use the tool if you don't have enough time. So if, for example, there is a project, and this project, as I would say, the time period of the project is less than 15 months, would you suggest to use your tool, or is there any possibility to adapt to the tool so that the organization can still use it?
Absolutely. This is, even we are adapting. Like when we started this process, we learn as we do. When we started this process, I mentioned we wanted a standardized tool that measures everything. I remember the back and forth with the gender specialist. The gender specialists are very, they say, Andres, change agency is a function of those 5 things. Like we can't take one out, and I get them. I get it. It's in their theory of change, right? But even in our projects, we've had to cater a little bit the tool and kind of select some domains, right? And even some variables to kind of align it to what we're doing. So Colom, to your example, if it's 15 months, a 15-month project, it depends on what you're doing and the intensity of what you're doing, right? But look, like, I don't think that you could measure changes in decision making in such a project, but you could, depending on what you're doing, measure perceptions, which is kind of like one subdomain. So take that, that's what you're doing, measure that, aligning it with what you are, what your interventions are, and kind of demonstrate change there, right? The continuum of change is around, knowledge, kind of attitudes in the middle, practice, and then, change of state. So depending on what you're doing and the length of your project, then focus at the right level, I would say.
Thank you, Andres.
Hi, this is Heather from CLWR. Building off that question, I'm wondering too, in terms of organizations that might have limited resources to invest in the data collection, whether you've administered your tool to a small subset of women and tracked their progress or tracked their change over a 5-year project, as opposed to administering it to the entire beneficiary demographic. And what experiences you learned from that, tracking a smaller group of women as opposed to a larger demographic.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Traditionally, like in older measurements, 5 years ago, I would traditionally include, forget about the index for a second. First, let me clarify that all of our measurements, because our population is so big, it's all sample based, right? So we calculate representative samples, and randomly select participants and measure. That's how we do it. And at Endline, it will be the same process. They are not the same, right? Ensuring representativeness and randomness, you can compare the two data points, right? So we don't do these longitudinal studies. But sometimes what I've done in the past, but I have to clarify, not with the index, is do these random samples, but also do a longitudinal analysis, right? So actually take what you mentioned, a cohort of women or adolescent girls and so on, and measure them as they go throughout. It's very rich data, is very important. But to your question, like, we haven't done it with this one. And it's a great reminder. We should.
Great, thank you. It's a very impressive tool.
But well, we can talk about it. It looks very impressive, but when we talk about like how you operationalize it and the challenges around it, there's still a lot of work to be done. So if you allow me, and we'll organize this a little bit, but if you allow me, I can talk a little bit about the challenges if you're curious in terms of like what we are, So first one, and I'm sure you've guessed it, one of the main challenges is around the length of the tool, right? It is extremely, extremely long. Not only because there are all these domains and subdomains. Look, if I had one question for each subdomain, it's a short tool. It's relatively easy to do. But actually, we ask a set of questions for every single variable or subdomain. So the questionnaire, just for the empowerment index is extremely long. And this is only the index. Remember the example of the PMF that I shared, that Ethiopia example? There were only 3 there, but there were like 12, 13 more sectoral indicators that we have to ask as well. So the tool becomes extremely, extremely, extremely long. So, sometimes we kind of have to compromise. So for example, social norms is so tricky to really capture, right? That, you can't do it with 1-2 questions. You need more. But then kind of we've had to shorten it. Look, one of the first examples, be it qualitative or be it quantitative, it is the nature of the questions. The framework can look great. I do these presentations. I can impress many people. I don't care. It all comes down to the tool, right? And this, every time we do this, there's a new iteration of the tool because we discover things that just don't work. What I was mentioning earlier, that politically correctness answers around, for example, decision-making or education of children, it's just, you have to be very, very, very smart in terms of asking the tool. So I'll give you a concrete example, right? So traditionally around decision-making, there's these questions around, you'll see it in every tool, right? So in your household, who makes the decision regarding, and then there's a list of things, buying small items, buying big items, education of children, et cetera, right? And then the variables would be like the man, the woman, and jointly. That's the most simplified tool. Experience after experience tells me, like I'm in a hardcore place in Pakistan, and everybody says jointly, right? That's not the case. Then you through your qualitative, you know that it's not true. There is a problem with that tool. There is definitely a problem with that question. So one has to think a little bit. So we've done several iterations. So it's all about the question. You can say, okay, so who makes a decision? But then you can frame it differently to try and capture that better. So for example, you can ask, look, if there was a disagreement in your household about this, who would have the final decision? You see, it's the same question, but it's phrased in a way that can take the person to answer a little bit more accurately. And like that, I have so many examples in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So the tool is extremely important. I'll give you a third challenge, and then I'll open it up for you guys. Actually, one of the issues with the index is for people to, wrap their heads around the index. Even within our staff, right? So for example, it's like, but what is it? What are the components? There's so many things that go into it that at the end of the day, they look at that number and it's meaningless. Like, what does 70 mean? I'm being completely candid here. Like, it's what happened. What does 70 mean, right? This happens with our partners, with our implementing offices, Plan Ethiopia, Plan, like what? It happens with donors. It happens with GAC all the time. Like, well, yeah, but what does it mean? Imagine a target setting exercise where you're going to say, okay, we're going to set a target for this project. So it's 70. At the end of a project, what is it going to be? Like 80, 90? How do you grapple that in terms of targeting? So that is a challenge as well. And we found ways around it to kind of demonstrate like what's within it and so on. I think that would be the other challenge. And then, we've mentioned this extensively. It takes a little bit more time than usual, right? And here what we require is a little bit more of donor education, I think, because actually the push, it's not that, there is a push from the donor community to be more robust in your M&E. There is, right? Even now, if you sign a contribution agreement with GAC, they'll kind of hint that they want a counterfactual, right? They want a control group or a comparison group. They won't. And they're saying, look, we want this measure, we want it more comprehensive, and so there's this push for better M&E. Like, there's no doubt about it, right? But at the same time, they're not giving us with the flexibility in terms of time, right? In terms of to do this right, to take our time, do the two-stage quantitative, qualitative approach. They don't give us that time, right? So yeah, that I think it's another big challenge. Okay, let me stop at that and take any more questions, if there are.
I have one again.
Or comments, yeah, go comments.
Andres, how are you dealing with this COVID-19 restriction, to collect data needed to feed your NDAS? Do you have any tips and tricks or strategy that you can share with us?
That's a question. That's a big question.
I know.
Let me think. The thing is, I've been like, so there's two parts to M&E, right? Monitoring and evaluation. Let me tackle evaluation first, and then let's talk about monitoring. So in terms of evaluations, like big studies, midterm, and like whatever, I've been personally within Plan Canada lucky because all of my projects are kind of not in a phase, like they all have their baseline and they're kind of implementing. So I've not encountered like, oh my God, what are we going to do in terms of measurement? Like, can we go out there and so on? I have one project that is soon going to do the end line. And what we've been doing is a scenario-based approach, right? So actually, so if 4 restrictions, this is Colombia, if 4 restrictions are off, we'll continue with our baseline as it is, right? If there are some restrictions, we might do a baseline, but forget our comparison group. There's a trade-off here. Like, don't get me wrong. There's trade-offs here, or even shortening the tool. So, for example, go on the phone. Do it on the phone, but that implies shortening the tool. Nobody will take a phone interview like for hours and hours, and compromising some of the indicators and focusing on the important ones. I know in other countries there is, as they go ahead with measurement, then there's some pieces that you have to put in place regarding, for example, enumerator training. So then there's all this protection, and you have to budget differently because you have to give them protection equipment. You have to embed in the training, protection mechanisms for enumerators and so on. Your terms of reference change a little bit. That is the evaluation side. So yeah, actually right now with restrictions, particularly in Africa, going down a little bit. So we're able to move, but putting in place in the terms of reference and in the training all these precautions. And as I said, a very important point, sometimes compromise, something has to give. So maybe it's an indicator, maybe it's your sample size. I hate to say it, was we can do full sample size right now, we'll have to do half and live with it, although it's not statistically significant in the case of quantitative pieces. Now for the monitoring part, that has been like a whirlwind of innovation, right? As in every intervention, right? So, we're having this training on Zoom. Like most of our interventions, particularly in Latin America, has shifted, like all the capacity development has shifted to the virtual world, right? So it's now we use a lot of Zoom, but very powerful in Latin America is via WhatsApp. WhatsApp groups and and so on. Like you'll see it everywhere. So for monitoring, it's like, oh my God, it's almost like a change of metrics, right? Like how I put it is, well, in the like for a training, in the absence of attendance sheets, we don't have those anymore. Then like what are our metrics, right? So it's this shift from attendance sheets, for example, to likes and shares and video views and so on. So we've developed these metrics and we use things to kind of track the traffic of messages and so on, even doing a little bit of content analysis. So this WhatsApp group, what are they talking about? The theme for the week was, Afro empowerment, if you wish. Are they talking about that through content analysis? So it's been like, evolving quickly and difficult.
Thank you, Andre. So you got some tips and tips to share. Thank you.
Maybe, I don't know. Anything else? All righty. Nico, how much time do we have?
So we only have about 2 minutes and 40 seconds.
What?
It's not yeah, 30 minutes have just passed quickly. But if we have any other round sort of comments or things that even, it's an interesting conversation because one of the comments you said is, how do you operationalize this, right? And especially on the scale of different organizations, small, medium, this may fit very differently, right? How do you actually take something, so let's say, such a framework and you put it in your own project or program? So I'm just kind of sort of rephrasing some of the kind of major conundrums that you have explained. And we don't have enough time. We only have a minute left. But if you want to do kind of like a last 1 minute sort of comment for our main room.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we went very different places, and I think that a lot was around like how can you take this into your organization, and guys, let me assure you, I think you can, right? Don't think of this index, don't think of it as an index, if you wish, but think of it as a framework, right? And even Isabel, even beyond like the quantitative part, like think about these domains as when you develop qualitative tools as well, right? So think about, I want to measure access and control. So kind of like the message here is, as an organization, if you're moving towards, working in terms of gender equality, kind of create your own framework that is comprehensive and has some domains and has some variables, and look at them and analyze them. And guys, focus on the tool. That's the most important piece.